Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am the host of the SERMAPod, also the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. We are very happy to have our latest guest, David Cummings. David is a new member of SERMA. He is a partner at Reed Smith LLP here in Chicago. It's a nationwide firm, but he happens to be here in the same city as I am and specializes in insurance recovery and policyholder advocacy. David, welcome to the SERMAPod.
Hey, Rich. Thanks for having me.
And we're talking today about some unique types of insurance products. We like to cover unusual things on this show. And I'll tell you, I've heard of Mariah Carey insuring her legs, David Beckham insuring his legs. I know that Julia Roberts famously, she insured her smile. And maybe the most famous is J-Lo insuring her butt, right? One of the most famous butts on the planet. So to start off, why don't you talk to us about that unique product being body part and characteristics insurance, how that works, who gets it, how much it costs, etc.
Sure. Well, you are right. It's a very unique form of insurance, one that is very common in the celebrity, the athlete space, but also in highly skilled professionals and other industries too. Like your surgeon, right, will often insure their hands. So essentially, at a high level, celebrity body part and physical characteristic insurance provides coverage for a person or an entity who has some insurable interest in a unique physical attribute or body part. They acknowledge or they regard that as an asset in some way, shape, or form. As you said, celebrities, athletes, musicians, highly skilled professionals in other industries, but also third parties such as a company who's engaging someone as a spokesperson and for, say, a campaign where a unique physical attribute might be very important. And as a result, there's a financial interest tied up in that. So think like, best example I can come up with is like a De Beers or Blue Nile campaign where the left ring finger might be crucial to a campaign, especially with a very prestigious spokesperson. So there might very well be a desire by both the company and the individual to insure that hand or insure that finger to make sure that if something were to happen, there's some financial recoupment there.
So for death and dismemberment coverage to kick in, typically a body part must be lost, right? I mean, how does that coverage work exactly?
So for celebrity body, so death and disgrace is kind of a separate category, but the celebrity body part and physical characteristic insurance, it can happen a number of ways. So I will say that this policy and kind of all the ones we're talking about today are very bespoke. They're not like your general liability where they're very form and a lot are very standardized. These are pretty case-by-case basis. The underwriter is very involved in the drafting. We'll borrow from some other policies too. But that's my long way of saying that definition can vary quite a bit depending on the nature of the body part, the individual or the company involved, and how broad or narrow coverage is desired or is affordable. Kind of the big distinction here is some will insure either a total or partial loss of the policyholder's body part or attribute, whereas others will go a little broader and say a total or partial loss of use of the policyholder's body part. Loss of can be construed a fair amount more literally, right? Like we literally need an amputation or something where the body part is gone. Loss of use is a little broader, and that's very important for like a surgeon, right? Where an injury or a loss of mobility may not be a total quote unquote loss, but certainly will have some detrimental financial impact by the inability to use to pre-injury levels.
And typically, what are the coverages involved? I mean, I guess it depends on, as you mentioned, it's bespoke insurance. It depends on the body part and the celebrity. But in your typical scenario, what kind of policy limits are we talking about?
Well, so coverage type, these are pretty. These policies, from at least the ones that I have seen, are almost always we'll put it this way, for a company, we'll say, who's taking out a policy on an individual or on a spokesperson, it's usually tied pretty neatly to the contract involved, right? The value of the contract. It can cover some incidental losses like replacements, media costs that are for media space that is no longer usable, to pay out the contract, of course. It becomes a little more amorphous and difficult when an individual takes out a policy themselves. It's still a first-party policy, but that insurable interest is no longer just in that contract or in a contract, but is tethered to that person's career. So that again really depends on, one, the appetite for the individual and the amount of the premium that they're willing to pay. But also ultimately that in the latter scenario where an individual is making a claim for their own body part or characteristic, that ultimately is going to be a bigger battle of the accountants as well, and what the trajectory looks like for that person's career and how that really impacts it. As you know, was it important for one movie? You mentioned Julia Roberts earlier. I had read an article that she had also, in connection with a project, insured her legs. But for that individual project, perhaps that body part was particularly important. That doesn't necessarily mean that the same importance is carried throughout her career, and it becomes far less tangible what kind of an impact that will have the further out we get.
Well, let's turn to something else you mentioned earlier, disgrace insurance. Mm-hmm. You know, I think you need look no further than, no one really reads papers these days, but right, I mean, look at your phone and every day you'll have a feed showing some other celebrity doing something dumb and being disgraced somehow. That, you know, people look at that and may consume it, but not everyone thinks how those actions might affect productions, film productions, theater productions. So what is disgrace insurance and what kind of losses do they cover? Sure.
So, again, a pretty bespoke coverage, but this one is I think, become a little more form as time has gone on. At least the versions that I've seen are fairly consistent. So you can purchase standalone disgrace insurance. We often see them packaged as both death and disgrace insurance. Essentially, the combined product protects against a risk that a celebrity or some talent will either die or suffer some sort of reputational disgrace that requires the removal from a campaign, from an engagement, from some sort of endorsement deal during the pendency of that engagement. So, you know, historically, the type of coverage we've seen here was for pretty much direct costs was at least how this all started, right? Specifically, it would cover costs associated with, you know, similar to the body parts types of coverage, reproducing existing ad materials with a replacement spokesperson, payment of that spokesperson, media space already purchased, no longer viable. Those are the kind of the big three that particularly in the advertising space comes to mind. The appetite has grown over the past years to extend coverage to business losses. So kind of similar to your business interruption, time element portions of a first-party property policy, right? There's an appetite for both companies and insurance companies to ensure and recognize that a company's brand recognition and overall reputation and ultimately profits might take a hit because of the loss of a spokesperson, either by death or through some form of public disgrace. So we see a little bit of both. Again, it depends on the appetite for the premium and the appetite for the insurer with the underwriting process too. But that can be added on too.
It seems the devil in this kind of coverage would be in the definition of disgrace, right? I mean, like you have to have, I mean, one element, of course, as you mentioned, would be advertisers jump ship, right? Let's say, you know, let's just take the Rush shooting as an example, high profile example. Lately, we've covered that extensively on this podcast. You know, that's the shooting on the set of the film Rust involving Alec Baldwin. You know, young lady died, cinematographer died, and that obviously shut down production. for a while. It's only now recently resumed. But in that scenario, how would you define disgrace? And that, that seems to be a fairly easy one, but there are some situations where one's definition of disgrace or whatever the triggering event may not be shared by someone else. And that's where I'm sure a lot of the friction arises.
I think you're 100% right. The bundled death and disgrace policies, death is by its very nature pretty black and white. That's not the portion that's disputed as much, but the definition of disgrace really is. So in the example that you just gave, if the insurance policy is tethered to Alec Baldwin, right, there can be a number of ways to determine whether or not that amounts to disgrace. By all accounts, at least by some accounts that are public, it was a very tragic and accidental event. So does there need to be some level of intent? Does there need to be some level of malice involved in the action for it to be qualified disgrace? In a lot of policies, yes. But that's, again, it's like I've been said a few times already today, these are very bespoke coverages that might not be the language, and it ultimately depends on the kind of waiting in the gray area there of what that definition is. I've got one fairly common one pulled up, a definition of disgrace, and it's certainly not a model of clarity. So this issue does come up quite a bit. It reads any criminal act or any offense, so that's a little more straightforward, right? Or any situation or occurrence which degrades or brings that person into disrepute or provokes insult or shock to the community. That almost sounds like a narrative paragraph. There's not a whole lot of detail there to say what that means. That could apply to as few or as many as any circumstances that you can come up with. So that's the tricky piece. I find an interesting intersection being the interplay of morals clauses in endorsement contracts and other talent agreements. Certainly during the underwriting process, say if a policy like this is tied to a celebrity endorsement, certainly in the underwriting, they're going to get the contract with the morals clause. The question is, can the insured leverage that clause in a way to add some clarity here? Like if we've defined certain events as immoral to justify termination of the contract, those might be per se examples that we can then list in the policy for some clarity, or they can be instructive during the claims process. But there is a real need for clarity in these, and there's not a whole lot of case law out there on these policies to provide much guidance.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems also the flip side to that is one person's disgrace would be another person's positive publicity, right? I mean, the old saying is there's no such thing as bad publicity, and you could almost argue, like I'm thinking of Britney Spears, right? Britney Spears was in the news the last week or so because, there's this allegation that she was walking into Catch in Vegas and she got slapped. Later turns out that the video doesn't support that allegation. Also, by the way, it just so happens she just announced this week the title of her upcoming autobiography. Some would speculate that this alleged slap, which results in her, being hit to the ground and her glasses flying off by Wembanyama's security guard, would just be a publicity stunt to sell more books, right? I mean, the timing is pretty interesting. So I guess there's two sides to that disgrace, that sometimes you get canceled, sometimes it actually helps your career.
That's true, and that's what makes it so tricky. And you raised this out the gate, Rich. The social media in the past 10 years has only made the question more difficult, right? I mean, arguably, what constitutes an actionable disgrace that requires a company to terminate an engagement is kind of directly related to the media outrage as a result of that. If before Twitter, before Facebook, before the internet, if we're going back a little further, if a celebrity or athlete did something that, by some would be deemed immoral or something of disrepute, if the media didn't pick it up and it didn't become widely known, no harm, no foul. But here, something can move so quickly and so many things are being filmed that it can be a lot easier to force a company's hand with things like with events like this, such that these policies become a lot more sensitive and might become a lot more important, even as we move further along in this social media world in which we live.
We sure do. David, speaking of athletes, and Wembanyama as an example, right? There's also athlete disability coverage. The news out of the NBA in the last week or so is that after 2 summer league games, Victor Wembanyama, who by now everyone probably knows was the Spurs #1 overall draft pick, 7'4" center, the next phenom, can't miss, superstar, about to make millions of dollars. It was his security guard that allegedly struck Brittany in Vegas. But, he played 1 game, and then he played a second summer league game that was way more impressive. And then the Spurs shut him down. Some speculate that there was some injury involved. But undoubtedly, the NBA was planning on selling a lot of tickets, albeit in the summer league, which isn't the most lucrative situation. But, they had a packed house that second game at the Thomas and Mack Center. Every seat was sold, lots of concessions, lots of jerseys. Presumably shutting down Wembanyama for the rest of the preseason is going to result in a significant loss of income for the arena, for the team, for the NBA. So what kind of insurance is available for those kind of situations? Again, understanding that in this case, it might not be an injury at all. It might be an effort to prevent an injury. But let's assume, for the sake of this discussion, that Wembanyama was injured in Game 2, couldn't play the rest. That's a significant amount of money that many people are out.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, their athlete disability insurance is pretty pervasive. So there's at a high level, it's designed to provide coverage if an athlete cannot compete in his or her sport. And there are policies that cover it even if it's on a temporary basis. There are other types of policies that are for career-ending injury as well. A temporary total disability, which is one that pays benefits if an athlete is injured in such a way that he or she cannot compete in the sport for a period of time. Those are the type of policies that the NBA, individual teams, the NBA as a whole, or any other league that has an insured interest in that player in the profits as a result of his or her performance would purchase. The permanent total disability policies, those are generally reserved for the athletes themselves. The distinction really being that, a team really only has an insurable interest in the length of the contract at hand, right? Whereas the player his or herself has an interest far beyond that for the duration of the career. So that's kind of the distinction there. Those types of policies, both types of policies are usually tethered to the value of the contract, or in the case of permanent total disability, the expected value of the career at the time of the underwriting, and is reevaluated throughout the policy term. But some of them do, again, bespoke policies will offer some form of lost profits protections for the teams and for the league. A pretty new and a pretty specific example of that is a type of policy called keyman insurance. Mm-hmm. We're seeing more and more of that. The underwriting on that and the value of that is a complicated web of actuaries that figure out how that works exactly. But essentially, those provide benefits to, usually in the context of a probable playoff team, that do not make the playoffs as the result, or at least arguably as a result, of the injury to a star player or what they call a key man. So that's a specific product specifically for losses in sales and in losses in revenue that they would have gotten in a playoff game. But certainly, athlete disability policies can and often do contain a lost profits component as well.
So let's look at another real world example, because the whole interest, or a lot of the interest in these subjects, results from, David, the fact that they happen every day, right? And that's kind of why we're around at SERMA. you need look no further than like today to see examples of all this. But I'm thinking of Pat Fitzgerald, the just fired coach at Northwestern, just a few miles north of where you and I are in Evanston, Illinois. Pat Fitzgerald was fired. He's at the start of a long, lucrative contract by Northwestern. There was an announcement a couple of days ago in the wake of this termination that the teachers at Northwestern signed a petition trying to stop the renovation of Ryan Field, the football stadium that is undergoing or about to begin undergoing a $600 or so million renovation. So I'm just thinking that, would Keyman insurance apply here? Would loss of value insurance apply here? And to what extent? Certainly, you can look at Pat Fitzgerald being fired as the beginning of a domino effect, right? We already know that some Northwestern players decommitted, some high school players. Some players are going to enter the transfer portal. This is not just a college, a football team. This is a big business involving a lot of tentacles. If this development doesn't proceed because of this termination, there's lots of people out a lot of money. So I just that's a good example of how impactful something like that could be, and I'm wondering sort of what the insurance implications are of that.
Yeah, so with the Northwestern scenario and Pat Fitzgerald, it would be tricky to find an argument for disability or Keyman insurance to apply there, right? Because that, historically at least, are tethered specifically to an injury of an athlete themselves. There is potentially an argument for a form of disgrace insurance, though, for something like this. Like he was terminated. There's a good argument that he was terminated because of something that brought disrepute and insult or shock to the community, borrowing the definition from the policy we talked about earlier. So that might be a place to look for that. Now, whether or not Northwestern carries that type of insurance, I'd like to think that they do. They're a sophisticated athletic program. But that's a potential avenue there, and there are certainly death and disgrace insurance policies that are written for not for actors or individuals other than athletes and celebrities, right? Many companies will purchase them for C-suite members as well for similar reasons, the reputation that carries along with that position. So it's possible they have such insurance in place, and should look to it if especially under the circumstances where there's a lot of losses potentially at stake as a result of the termination and the terminations that seem to be coming.
Yeah, I don't think we've heard the end of the Northwestern story. I think it's only scratching the surface, so there's more to come on that. New SERMA member David Cummings from Reed Smith, thank you so much for educating us on this really interesting and unique part of the insurance world as it relates to sports and entertainment. Please come back and give us some more content as we go forward.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.